Hi, this is Ryan from clovisstar.com, xcannabis.com, capitalismtools.com. It's the 10th of May 2016. I just wanted to reply to a couple of these interested people on YouTube and Facebook that I converse with on my stance for whether I'm going to vote for Trump or not. Now, I have said ever since last August that I believe Trump is Hillary's wingman. I mean, Trump, I remember listening to him saying that Hillary went to his wedding, that, he was a supporter of Hillary. I see pictures of him with Hillary. They're buddies. They always have been. I think Trump is Hillary's wingman. My friend says, and yet you do not get how good Bernie is because you stick to doctrine instead of seeing the balance. Now, I don't just stick to doctrine. I probably supported more progressive candidates than my friend here. Growing up, as a young adult anyway, from the year 1999 all the way to the year 2011, I supported Ralph Nader, who has probably 95% of his platform in common with Bernie Sanders. Now, the spending is what gets me with Bernie. Bernie's going to collapse our economy. Not only is he going to do that, he's going to push jobs and businesses out of this country by taxing them to the kilt. It's not good. It will destroy our economy, and I can't have that for my children. I got a comment on YouTube because someone said, well, you went to retire so that you could spend time with your kids and wife, and yet now you're going to come out of retirement to support Ron Paul. Yeah, basically, and I've always worked at home. I've always spent time with my wife and kids. Even when I was working brutal hours, I was working from home. I've always loved spending time with my children and my wife. Point is that I fear for our country's future, and Ron Paul, I believe, is the man to fix that. And he always has been for me ever since I learned about his platform back in 2011. He ran in 2008, didn't really pay much attention to him. In 2011, I really caught on to what he was all about. And so, no, I'm not just stuck on doctrine. If I was stuck on doctrine, I'd be supporting Bernie right now. I switched my doctrine. I switched my platform. I switched my ideals, from being very progressive to being very conservative, because I want to see the future of America be better. Not just easy, but better. Good things don't come easily. You have to work for it. Anyway, I said here to my friend, I said, I would never vote for Bernie. There is simply no way. Studies by good, well-known economists say his free stuff campaign will cost $28 trillion, and even with his new tax proposals, his plan will add $15 trillion more to the existing debt, essentially doubling the debt. And I think there was a debate between him and Hillary on April 15th, and Wolf Blitzer proposed that to him and named some of those sources, and I'll get to some of those sources in a minute. I said he always uses Scandinavia and France and such nations as those that give free shit, but they also empower capitalism and tax businesses at less than half of what Bernie proposes. He is not just suggesting increased taxes to the ultra-rich. He is proposing new taxes to everyone, even those making as little as $20,000 a year. Corporations will get raped under his plan, thus forcing more and more jobs overseas. These are all facts that I have documented with mountains of credible sources and references. Would I crash our economy to, quote, balance the force? I am pragmatic, just not crazy. I would rather have a Trump than a Sanders at any day. I respect your support for him, and I understand what you are saying. I get that you believe he is sincere and whatnot. These are the same reasons that I used to be a, quote, Nader Raider, unquote, for 11 years. I loved Ralph Nader, and for all of those reasons. I supported Ralph Nader from 1999 to 2011, and Bernie reminds me of Ralph Nader. But I considered his plan and compared it to Ron Paul's plan when Ron Paul was running. Then I looked at Bernie's plan and considering the implications to the economy, I just can't support Bernie. If Bernie wants to win me over, when he starts comparing the USA to other nations, he needs to model his plan after Switzerland, not Sweden. Then he's got me. Until then, no way. And Sweden and some of these Scandinavian countries and France, they have massive turbulence in their economy right now. To say they've got a smooth running economy is a joke. They have major turbulence. But the reason why their socialism has been paid for and has worked for a very short time, since basically the 1990s, it's a very new system, but it's because they have a 22% corporate tax rate like in Denmark. And the individual taxpayer, even those making like $20,000 a year, are paying 62%. So the corporations pay a third of what the individuals pay. They encourage and infuse capitalism with benefits and encouragement, and they make sure that capitalism thrives so that they can pay for this stuff. You can't just punish capitalism, punish businesses, punish corporations, and expect there to be jobs and wealth. When you do that, you do what we have done and you push jobs overseas. The United States at 39.2% has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Period. Hands down, flat out. That's the end of the story. Full stop. And that's just 90% of the businesses. There's like 10% of the businesses in this country that get these loopholes. So why isn't Bernie just saying let's close the loopholes? Because that would fix the problem. Not increasing taxes and barring entry into the economy and forcing jobs overseas. Just kill the loopholes and look at the individual. If you have kids, or if you have a job, or if you have both, you get earned income credits, child tax credits, all these other credits. I don't know if I've ever actually paid income tax to the government. They've taken it out of my check over the years, and then I've gotten it back and then some at the end. And I've never made over $110,000 a year. My best year has been just a little under 110. And so, if I can get full-on tax refunds after paying very little in, and still get more than I paid in back at $110,000 a year, well, then what about the people who make less than me? I don't think there's hardly anybody in the tax bracket of where I've been and lower that actually have ever paid a tax to the income tax. And it's a fact, and I made this video before, and I'll post a link to it here, and there's plenty of references to this. Thetaxfoundation.org, you can look at this. The top 50% of income earners pay 97% of the income tax. The bottom 50% pay 3% of the income tax. That's the polar opposite of the way Scandinavia does it. This is what I would like to see our model after. Because, this socialist state that we're in the United States, we're not a capitalist nation. We haven't been for 50 years since, the New Deal. Roosevelt's old plan, from the 40s or whatever, the New Deal. We haven't had any kind of free market for a very long time. And if you look even before that, you look at 1913 when, the progressives under Woodrow Wilson. God, I keep getting those two mixed up. Woodrow Wilson. Anyway, you look at what they did. They sold the economy basically for campaign funds to the banks, and they turned over our treasury to the Federal Reserve. And now the Federal Reserve, they've never had a dime to contribute of their own. They just create money out of nothing, and then they put an interest rate on it that we pay as taxpayers. They're printing funny money, and we're paying the interest rate on something that never existed to begin with. That's what the progressives did in 1913 under a Democratic-run executive branch, House, and Senate. They led all three branches of the government, and they did the dirty deal that sold our economy over to the big banks. Now Bernie's like, oh, we need to take it away from the big banks, the big banks, the big banks. Well, he's not even talking about breaking up the Federal Reserve. He's not even talking about ending the Federal Reserve Act. He's leaving that intact. That's where the problem is. He wants to go after the middlemen, not the problem. The middlemen aren't the problem. They're the result of the problem. He wants to go after them. It doesn't make any sense. Go after the Federal Reserve like Ron Paul wanted, And Ron Paul talks about Bernie Sanders screwing up that Audit the Fed Act or Audit the Fed bill in 2010, where they seemed to be both in agreement before the committee, and they worked on it together for months. And then in committee, Bernie Sanders lessened the scope of the Federal Reserve audit and gave shelter to the banks. He doesn't really care about breaking up the banks or punishing the banks. He wants to just tax the hell out of the economy. Why do that? Why push jobs overseas? So no, I've got to cut this short. But there's two people that I want to play for you, and I think I'm just going to have to give you links. But the problem that I've had, and I just had this discussion with people, is that Bernie Sanders in 2009 voted in favor of raising congressional pay, but he wants all the businesses, all the corporations to pay more into the government where he receives a paycheck from. But he's not willing to give up any of his white privilege. When it comes to taxing those who make a high income like he makes over $175,000 a year in premium benefits and insurance. But if he wants to raise taxes and all this stuff, but he doesn't want to, let his income go down. He wants to increase his income to compensate for these higher taxes. That's why he votes for the congressional pay raise. So Amherst DeSouza, he talks about this, and he's going to respond to this liberal in this college here in. Let me just play this for you. I'm going to put a.
I don't just say it in I don't say it in a self-flagellating and self-aggrandizing way.
Okay, go on.
I really try not to. I'm simply saying that because you asked me. Really, I view the recognition of one's privilege as an impetus to change things. So I don't just say I have white privilege. I try to help those who have not benefited from such privilege.
How? Hold on. Let's pursue this for a moment.
Sure.
You say... this is actually very important because there's a psychology here, right?
Well, you see, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm really not trying to attack you. I'm not trying to be provocative. I just find that often, I think the essence of much of this discourse surrounds hypocrisy, and you're trying to demonstrate that I'm a hypocrite. I say I benefit from white privilege, yet I don't actually do anything. But I'm gonna backpedal and say that ultimately I think what the greatest vice is cruelty, and I don't want to be hypocritical. So to answer your question, I'll start in high school. Do people want to hear this, or do we?
Educated. I don't know.
Look, let me say where I'm going with this, because I think you're.
All right. Well.
Too bad.
All I was to say, it's not like I picked anyone out to help based on the color of their skin, but I was a tutor for people who tended to be low income when I was in high school. I suppose that would be one direct answer to your question, because oftentimes disparate educational opportunities are grounded in disparate economic systems, or systems that produce disparate economic outcomes. So that's one way that I would combat it on an individual level.
All right. Here's what I'm getting with this, okay? One of the benefits of a good education of reading people like Nietzsche is you begin to understand how deep the human desire is for moral self-exculpation. Moral self-exculpation. Now, you say, and I didn't say this, you said this, I'm a beneficiary of illicit white privilege. Okay?
Illicit?
Well, isn't all white privilege illicit? Is it deserved?
Well, in this current system, there is legality.
Illicit means immoral.
Okay. Then,
immoral white privilege. Yeah. Okay. So then if I were to say to you, there are surely many deserving minorities who would like to come to Amherst but have the inherited disadvantage of American history. Therefore, since you are an acknowledged beneficiary of illicit privilege, would you be willing to step aside voluntarily, putting your own moral mouth where your self-proclaimed virtue is, and give your seat, not my seat. I realize you may be super generous with other people's advantages and favor affirmative action, so other white kids who apply to Amherst are turned away to open spaces for minorities. But I'm not talking about you acting out your virtue on them. I'm talking about you acting out your virtue on you. Mm-hmm. Are you willing to give up your illicit seat that you don't deserve here at Amherst to make room for a disadvantaged minority? Yes or no?
Anyway, and that's the thing, is that these liberals that want to give up white privilege, and want to give up, maybe taxes to the system that will benefit lower income people, they're not willing to give up their own particular privilege. They just want a system to change so that privilege will be receded for so-called white privileged folks, but they don't feel like that's their duty to give up their particular privilege. Just like Bernie Sanders, in 2009, he votes for raising the congressional minimum wage, or the congressional pay, that's already $175,000 a year, which equals out to about $87.50 an hour. As if though that's not enough for this guy who's never actually really held a real job in his life besides being a career politician. But that's not enough. Public service is more than public service to him. It's actually a paycheck. So he's going to say, okay, well, everybody needs to pay more taxes that are in this income bracket that I'm in, but I want my pay to be raised, and I want the taxpayers to pay it. That's what I have a problem with Bernie. Not that he wants to raise the minimum wage and he only wants to pay his interns, some of them $12 an hour, some of them he doesn't pay anything, you know, and that's not even the biggest problem. It's just that he wants everybody else to pay to equal out the system and balance things out, but he doesn't want it to come out of his paycheck. He wants to raise his paycheck so that when the taxes go up, he is compensated so that his income doesn't go down. You know, that's the facts. You know, and then I've talked about this with Thomas Sowell. He's a legendary economist. You know, he's worked in the Labor Department. He's taught at many universities, Stanford. You know, he's been just a well-renowned economist all over. And I just want to play a little bit of his. And now, like I said, I started out, I grew up in a Union Democrat home. I was always very, liberal, very progressive, even at a very early age, But I've supported Ralph Nader and whatnot, and I changed just like Thomas Sowell did. I had a revelation, and this is his story.
In your early years, you were a Marxist.
Yes.
What happened? How'd you get away from that?
I took a job in the government. I went to the University of Chicago as a Marxist. After a year of studying under Milton Friedman, I was still a Marxist. But one summer of working in the government was enough to start returning around.
Really, what happened to you there?
Well, nothing happened to me, but that I realized that the government was nowhere close to being capable of doing what people on the left wanted the government to do. And that, in fact, we'd be lucky if they didn't make things worse. For example, I was in the Labor Department, and they administered the minimum wage law. To me, the question was, did minimum wage laws make poor people better off or worse off? Mm-hmm. That was not the question for them. The minimum wage law provided 1/3 of their total budget. And they weren't going to look at this other way. And as I tried to get into the question of does this cause unemployment and stuff like that, there was no enthusiasm whatsoever for that whole line of reasoning.
If you look at another government statistic, which includes those people who have given up looking for work, and those people, those millions of people who are working part-time when they want to work full-time, real unemployment today is close to 11%. That is unacceptable. And let me touch on an issue that is widely ignored. Almost nobody talks about it. And that while real unemployment is close to 11%, youth unemployment has reached tragic proportions.
I am concerned about what we do for people who are presently in a very disadvantaged position because of what's happened in the economic
crunch. We try to remove
as
many of the barriers as possible that have put them in that position.
And you think the barriers that have put them in that position are, for example, minimum wage law?
Minimum wage laws, labor unions, occupational licensing.
Would you abolish labor unions? Huh? Would you abolish labor unions?
You don't have to abolish labor unions. I'm saying that if you're asking me what are some of the things that have done it, I'm giving you some of the things that have done it.
So let's start with a lot of the more controversial things that you've written about, Walter, in your life, the things that you're most known for, but also most controversial, and especially your book on the state against blacks, because this is an entirely unconventional view. Most people in this town view the state and a lot of the government programs and taxation programs as aiding minorities, and especially blacks. And you're making the argument in your writings for 30, 40 years and in your book that, in fact, policies like the minimum wage, the expansion of the welfare state, have actually been a setback for minorities. How do you defend yourself against your critics?
Well, if you look at the minimum wage, most Americans support the minimum wage and increase in the minimum wage because they have good intentions. They think that, gee, it will help low-skilled people earn higher living. But when you look at public policy, you should not look at the intentions behind public policy. You should ask the question, what are the effects? And you can see the effect of the minimum wage law if you put yourself in the place of an employer. And you say, and you have to pay $7.25 an hour no matter whom you hire. Well then, would you hire a worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that would only enable him to produce $3 or $4 worth of value per hour? Well, most employers will look at that as a losing economic proposition. That is to pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody could only produce $4 worth of value per hour. And so the effect of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled people. And if you...
That's the reason why I oppose the minimum wage laws. I've worked for $3 an hour, $3.50 an hour. When I was 14 years old, I dug ditches for Mapleton Irrigation. I was 14. It was a agricultural job, so I could get paid less than minimum wage. At the time, minimum wage was $4.25. This was 1992. I worked for that $3.50 an hour. I worked my ass off 2 summers. I did good the first summer. They hired me back the second summer. I worked that job and I busted my butt. And I made less than a burger flipper down at McDonald's. But I did it because I wanted to get into the workforce and I wanted to get a reference and I wanted to work my way up the rung of the ladder of the economics. Of the economic ladder, that is, of having a better job and getting more from, having experience and references. And that's what, minimal wage jobs are for. Getting experience, getting references, and moving up the ladder. But if you're barred entry into the workforce by minimum wage, because like Walter Williams says, you can only produce $4 or $5 an hour because your skill set will only allow you to produce that much. And then the employer has to pay you more than you're able to produce, well, he's not going to hire you. So then you're barred from being, from getting entry into the workforce and getting those skills and getting those references and getting that experience. So you never enter the workforce. And like Bernie Sanders says, we have a higher unemployment rate. Well, minimum wage laws make that happen. These are 2 well-known economists, Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. Look into them. Anyway, that's all I got to say. I do spend time on social media trying to do what I do. Well, politicians do it for pay. I don't do it for pay. I do it because I love to see my family and my country do better. And for us to, be more, progressive in, valuing work, not handouts. To be more progressive and more pragmatic in producing jobs and encouraging wealth and encouraging investment and encouraging job productions than discriminating against it and pushing it away. So that's why I do this. It's not for pay. It's not like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders gets $175,000 a year for this, and for some reason that's not even enough for him. So I'm sorry, I can't do this for money. This is a public service for me. Peace.